Hey everyone, welcome back to Wicked Deeds. We're your hosts. I'm Brittany.
And I'm John.
And before we dive into today's case, we just wanted to give a heads up to our listeners who are hearing this episode the week of its release that we'll be off next week, February 21st, but we will be back the following Tuesday, February 28th, with a new case. With that being said, in today's episode, we'll be discussing the case of a 17-year-old girl who took a shortcut home one rainy night and was found murdered the following day. Over the years, there hadn't been much coverage of her case until those who'd suffered similar tragedies in the area stepped in to assist. But even with that added assistance and advancements in DNA technology, this case remains unsolved nearly 39 years later. Today's case is about the murder of Patricia Ann Gonyea. "17-year-old Patricia Ann Gonyea, who went by Patty Ann, was the second oldest of 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls in total. Back in 1984, she lived at 71 Southgate Street in Worcester, Massachusetts, with her mother, Kathleen, and 4 of her 5 siblings. From what I can tell, her parents were not together, and her father lived across the country in California at the time. Patty Ann was a senior in high school in 1984 and was described as a, quote, model student who got mostly all A's and B's in her classes. She attended South High Community High School in Worcester and was set to graduate the following year in 1985. After graduation, Patty Ann aspired to attend college in California and planned to major in accounting. And something her mother had once mentioned that Patty Ann had wanted was to be successful and build a family of her own, and she aspired to land a job where she'd be able to work from home, which I found to be a particularly interesting comment considering Patty Ann would have been going to college back in the mid-'80s, would have graduated by the late 80s. So my first thought was, you could work from home back in the late 80s? I know that's probably super naive of me to say, but it's the honest truth. And John and I were even talking about this the other day while I was researching this case, and really the only thing that came to my mind when I brought up the topic was Stranger Things. I know, I'm bringing up a television show reference, but I was thinking of like when Joyce worked at home in one of the later seasons and she was selling encyclopedias.
Ah, yeah.
So I wonder if accounting maybe was like that back in the 80s. I don't really know.
I guess, I mean, if you were doing the accounting for some business and they just provided you all of their paperwork and you took it home, I guess it doesn't really matter where you're doing the work as long as you're doing it accurately.
Yeah, like you have your ledger and your calculator, and you should be good to go, I guess. I mean, I'm probably like dumbing down the job a lot by saying that, but...
Yeah, but I guess it was a dream even back then to just be able to work from home.
Yeah, honestly. And I think a lot of the reason why Patty Ann may have wanted to work from home was because of how much she helped her mother out with her siblings. I'm sure seeing her mom struggle to make ends meet as a single mother and take care of her children likely shaped Patty Ann's plans for after college. Her mother had worked outside of the home, and she wouldn't get back until about an hour after all of her kids got home. So pretty much every night of the week, Patty Ann made it a point to help her mother out. She was always there watching her siblings for her to make things as easy on her mom as possible, and her mother did not let that go unnoticed. When, on multiple occasions, she'd brag about Patty Ann and stated that she truly couldn't have asked for a better daughter. And that's just one example of Patty Ann's wonderful personality and work ethic. She not only helped her mom out all the time, but she had 3 jobs as well. She waitressed. I saw that she had 2 jobs at 2 different restaurants near the Worcester area, one being at a place called Abdow's Big Boy Family Restaurant, which I know. I was like, that is the most bizarre name of a restaurant, but okay. But that was located in Auburn, Mass. And then I also saw it reported that she worked at another place called Aunt Belle's Restaurant. And on top of that, she also worked other babysitting gigs to make extra cash as well. So if you couldn't already tell, Patty Ann was a hard worker, an all-around good kid, and everyone just adored her.
Yeah, I'm surprised that she was the second oldest because it seems like she's taking on a lot of responsibilities that the first oldest usually would.
Yeah, so the first oldest, if that's how you want to, classify them, but they did not live in the home anymore. I don't know whether they were at college or something like that. So technically...
She was the oldest in the house.
Yes, exactly. Her older brother described her as, quote, very popular with a good sense of humor and always on the go, end quote. And that easygoing personality of hers made it simple for Patty Ann to make friends. And there was actually this little group that she was a part of at school, which was simply dubbed the Three Patties, because the crew consisted of Patricia Ann Gonyea, Patty Morgan, I think that's her married name now, and Patty LaCoye. Again, I think that's her married name.
Sounds
and I
French.
apologize for butchering the last name if I did. But the three girls not only went to school together, but they all lived in the same area in Worcester. It was near Southgate Street and Canterbury Streets.
I wonder if the three Patties all slung patties at big boys.
I wonder.
That would be wild.
That would be wild. But as the girls grew older and their friendship blossomed, they became inseparable. They were the best of friends. And these friends, as well as others and her family, all said that Patty was also really interested in sports. She liked track, horseback riding, and roller skating. So it's like this girl literally did a little bit of everything, it seems.
It sure seems that way.
Things weren't totally perfect in Patty Ann's household. Her family had been through quite a lot, and they struggled with money. And obviously, like I mentioned before, her mother was working to support 5 children who still lived at home, so it definitely didn't seem easy. And the area where they lived in Worcester was described as a low-income area at the time. And John, I do actually have a Google Maps image of like what this area looked like, and specifically Patty Ann and her family's home for you to take a look at.
Okay. I mean, just to go along with that while you're sending me this, you can imagine, a single mother taking care of 5 kids, taking care of 6 at one point until the oldest got old enough to move out.
Mm-hmm.
But luckily and rightfully so, she was able to brag about Patty being able to help her, because think of how much harder it would have been to get by if she wasn't working those 3 jobs.
Absolutely.
Okay, it looks like your typical urban style neighborhood, I guess.
Yeah,
multiple
definitely.
high-rise, like not really tenement housing, but you have,
Multifamily homes.
multifamily homes.
Yeah.
And,
Yep.
of course, a bar on the corner
I didn't even
with the
notice
Budweiser
that.
sign right there.
Yep.
Probably the local watering hole for everyone.
I am sure.
Oh, and it's Gerton's Cafe, at least now.
Ooh.
That's got to be a French name too, right?
Yeah.
A lot of French people in the story. Worcester, probably a lot of Frenchies there.
Interesting. Didn't even think of that. I don't know. I think of our area more as French because I feel like anytime we talk to people and we tell them our name, they're like, what?
Yeah, I think that Rhode Island in particular had a lot of French people settling here.
Yeah.
They worked in the mills. At least some of my relatives did.
Mm-hmm.
So I would assume, it's a stone's throw away in the grand scheme of the
New
country.
England.
Right, New
Yeah.
England. So Worcester, you had 146 going all the way up to Worcester.
Mm-hmm.
So makes sense.
Did you look at the overhead that I sent you as well?
I did not stand by.
Okay. This, I think, shows more so how it is more urban, very condensed.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of things in this small area.
University Park.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a not great location from my memory.
I feel like I vaguely remember that
A body being pulled from the body of water over there.
Oh, really?
I think so.
I was thinking more along the lines of when we went to your sister's.
Yes. So
Wasn't that like you had to drive past that or
Yeah.
somewhere near that to get to her house?
Yeah, her old house. I think so. I think University Park was like, you don't go in there. And this is somewhat recently, and I could be misconstruing because it's been roughly a decade or so since I worked up that way.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure University Park, even as recent as a decade ago, was not the greatest area.
Well, people
be
were
in.
saying that back then in 84, when this case took place, it wasn't as bad of an area.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, this was a little bit more of a lower income area, but it wasn't like crazy high crime, kind of like we were talking about when we were discussing Bill Sproat and Mary Petrie's case,
Yeah.
how that area was just rife with crime.
Right.
This was a little bit different, and I think as time has gone on, it has gotten worse than it used to be.
Yeah, I think that goes with everywhere. Anytime that we talk about a place that in the past maybe wasn't totally crime-ridden,
Yeah.
but wasn't the greatest place, it generally progresses, and nowadays is probably even worse than what it was before, because it doesn't seem, unless there's a huge injection of money from the government to like totally change an area, that these low-income places get better. They usually get worse over time.
Yeah. Also, I did want to bring up something now about her family's struggles financially in that situation. So, according to reporting done for the Boston Globe, there was actually this specific prayer called Footsteps that was read at Patty Ann's funeral.
That is a very famous I know you're not big into funerals. I'm not big into funerals as I like to go to them, but I've been to a lot.
I've literally been to 2 in my whole life, and it was in the last year. So,
yeah. So footsteps is like very popular. It's usually on the back of like prayer cards.
Okay,
so this is super well known.
Very interesting. I didn't know that, so I am glad that I brought this up and we could kind of have this discussion about it. So, Patty Ann's family was very religious. Their faith was important to them, and there's this specific comment both from the priest and then the author of this Boston Globe piece that I just wanted to read for you so you can kind of get an idea of Patty, her family, why they might have chosen this specific prayer, all that. So
we already know that Patty is murdered.
Yeah, I just thought it encapsulated kind of what her family struggled with, but the fact that their faith was important to them. So I wanted to bring it up now. Obviously, I think everybody listening knows at this point what has happened in this case. We just haven't gotten there yet in the timeline of the story.
Okay, and it gives you a good lens to view the family through, knowing that their faith was important to them.
Yeah, definitely. So the priest had stated, quote, Patty really liked the prayer because her family had gone through a lot. They are very poor people and their faith has been important to them, end quote. And then the Boston Globe piece continues on to describe that this prayer essentially depicts the Lord carrying those during their times of need or troubled times. So it kind of like sets the stage for you to say, you know, their faith is important to them. Yes, they struggled with money. Yes, you know, their life was more difficult. They were in this different type of, you know, socioeconomic world. And this prayer was something that was important to them. It was important to Patty Ann. It was important to her family. So I think it just kind of shows the faith that they had and all of that.
That it's something that they clung to help them get through difficult times.
Yeah, I'm sure. And I'm sure it was one of those things that after all of this happened, they probably clung to it then as well. Mm-hmm. Now, moving on the night of October 22nd, 1984, Patty Ann was doing what she normally did during the week. She was watching her siblings and waiting for her mom to arrive home from work. On certain days, Patty would also work at either one of her waitressing jobs or babysitting, but this particular night she had off of work, so she had plans to go to her boyfriend's house once her mom got home. As per usual, her mother arrived and saw Patty Ann along with her boyfriend. I guess he was like at the house with her already. Maybe they had just gone there after school or something and were waiting until her mother got home for them to then take the bus to his house. So she said that they were going to go head to his place. Kathleen started to make dinner for everyone really quick. Patty Ann gave her mom a kiss on the cheek and headed out the door to go to the bus station with her boyfriend.
Do we have a boyfriend name?
I don't. He's just going to be called the boyfriend.
The boyfriend. Okay.
Yep. So the two took the bus to her boyfriend's house, which was located on Burncoat Street in Worcester, which was about 8 miles or roughly a 15-minute drive from Patty Ann's house. So that night, everything was totally normal, and Patty Ann and her boyfriend, as well as I believe his father or another family member of his family, were playing board games, which included Trivial Pursuit and cards.
I love it.
Right? We're big board game people over here.
Board game, cards.
Video games.
All
of it.
Anything to have fun.
Yeah. So later on that night, one of Patty Ann's boyfriend's family members was supposed to be driving her home. I've heard in multiple different sources that it could have either been his brother or maybe even his mom who was supposed to drive her home. But regardless of who it was, her ride hadn't arrived home by the time Patty Ann would have needed to leave. So, with her being the responsible teen she was, around 9:30, 9:45 p.m., she took a quick moment to give her mom a call to let her know she'd be getting home a bit later than usual. At first, she planned to wait for this ride to show up at her boyfriend's house to drive her back home, but as the night continued on and it just kept getting later and later, and whoever was supposed to give her this ride still hadn't gotten back, Patty made the, yet again, very responsible decision to take the bus, so she didn't miss it entirely for the night. At this point in the evening, the bus was probably going to stop running soon. It did appear as though it did run late, but who knows when the last stop was, so she wanted to make sure that she didn't wind up either stranded or waiting even longer to get home for whoever this, person was that was supposed to give her a ride to show up. Mm-hmm. So roughly sometime between 10 and 11 p.m., Patty Ann's boyfriend walked her to the bus station. She hopped on the bus to head home. And it was reported that he did wait there to make sure that she was safely on the bus and headed on her way before he made the trek back to his house for the night. Now, this bus ride was likely going to take only about 15 to 25 minutes, considering however many stops there might have been on the way back into the Worcester area where Patty Ann lived. But it was reported that she arrived to the bus stop, which was on Main Street, pretty much right in front of Clark University, around 11 or 11:15 p.m.
So we know that she got on the bus she rode the bus and she was getting off where she would have in order to get home.
Correct, and she did get off. There was a sighting of her. She was seen getting off the bus between this 11 and 11:15 time frame, so we know she made it there. But unfortunately, the weather that night was pretty crappy, and it was raining heavily. So Patty Ann threw open her umbrella and began the walk from this Main Street area to her house on Southgate Street. On average, at least based on my research, a walk from Main Street to Southgate Street should have taken about 12 to 15 minutes. But there was apparently a shortcut that a lot of teens from the area used back in '84 that may have cut the walk down a little bit. But in order to make it home using this shortcut, Patty Ann would need to cross the railroad tracks, which were just 2 blocks from her house. And I do also just want to say that some people that, said that they were from this area said that the walk would have been shorter than this 12 to 15 minute time frame. So maybe I'm totally off on how long it would have taken. Maybe it was a 5-minute walk. Maybe it was a 10-minute walk. But it's not like she's walking 45 minutes to get home from the bus stop. So I just wanted to make that clear. It was a relatively short walk.
Now, I know we reference a lot of our other cases when doing these cases, or anytime that we're talking about any type of case.
Yeah.
Generally, we reference ones that we've covered before.
Mm-hmm.
And 2 come to mind already.
Okay.
I'm going to need your help with the names.
Yep.
The boy who was killed on top of the hill near the DPW.
Henry Bedard.
Henry Bedard Jr.
Mm-hmm.
And then the one where the girl was killed behind the mall in the woods when it was raining.
I think that was Kathy Beatty.
Kathy Beatty.
She lived and then she ended up dying a week later. Yeah.
Those are the 2 that flashed into my head just hearing what you've told so far.
Those did not flash into my head, but I can completely understand why.
Yeah.
They would have, gone into
Because I'm thinking a shortcut for Henry Bedard Jr. I'm thinking,
mm-hmm.
taking the shortcut over through the DPW and being in the woods, kind of. So
no, that makes perfect sense.
There was
I get
that
it.
one, and then because of the heavy rain, Kathy Beatty's mom had talked to the police officer. The police officer did the check of the area.
Yep.
But because it was raining, who knows how well he could see or how well he even checked.
Yeah, it's very true.
So those are the 2 things that kind of brought me to those cases.
Yeah, I feel like you might feel like this case kind of, just has a similar vibe. I think more so to Henry Bedard.
Yeah.
So we'll see as we keep going.
All right.
So her family actually later provided an explanation of pretty much exactly what Patty Ann's route would have been. But before I explain it to you, like exactly the street she would have taken, how she would have walked home, John, I'm going to send you a copy of the map of the area now so you can kind of follow along. And as always, for those listening, a copy of that map will be on our website so you can follow along if you choose to. So, John, if you want to open that up now, that's the same map I sent to you before.
The overhead?
Yep.
All right.
So her family said that she obviously got off at the bus stop on Main Street. So on this map, you can see up top there,
top left of the image.
Yes. So there's Main Street there. You have Gate Street, which goes down, Grand Street, Wyman Street, right?
Yes.
But you can see where the little red dot is, 71 Southgate Street. So she needs to go essentially from the top left-hand corner of this map down to the bottom right-hand corner of the map.
Mm-hmm.
So she would then walk along Grand Street. And so if you can tell, obviously she could go Main Street, like all the way essentially off this image to not go over the railroad tracks because there's this Gardner Street that is actually a street. It's not like cutting over the tracks.
Yep.
So she would go down Grand Street, and then you can see literally where the tracks are here, like right below where Philip P. Masad Movers is listed on that. So she would walk all the way down Grand, literally cut over the train tracks, and then she would be home almost immediately from there.
All right. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I see. Because at first I was like, well, the railroad tracks kind of go through all these streets.
Yes.
But,
essentially, you're cutting over the tracks, and I'm sure there's probably, you probably went through people's backyards and stuff like that. There probably was more to this whole shortcut than just, walking down that street, but that's what was put out by the family, so.
Right. I would say, the fastest way from point A to point B is a straight line, so if the bus stop was near Grand Street and she could just cut straight pretty much to her house, it makes sense to, walk over the
train
tracks.
Yeah.
Unless it was taking you through an unsavory area, because I know this is not an old map. This is a more current map, but you have the Royal Worcester Apartments right on Grand Street. And if that was a big apartment complex back in the day, and, it was a low-income area. Maybe there were some unsavory characters hanging around the outside of an apartment building. Maybe you wouldn't want to go down Grand Street. But if this was the way that she always went and she felt comfortable this way, it was raining, she wanted to get home as soon as possible, it was already late, I can totally understand her wanting to go down that way to get home as fast as possible.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you brought that up, because there was this comment that I saw in this article that I found in the Daily Hampshire Gazette, and the reporter had interviewed a girl that lived in the neighborhood, I think, or was just like a friend of hers, went to school with her, and they were talking about, why she would have taken this route. And this article says, quote, "She said she did not know why Miss Gonyea would have used the shortcut very late at night. I guess it was because it was pouring out. She wanted to get home, she said," end quote. So her saying that almost insinuates to me that maybe this wasn't the best area to walk through late at night.
But it was the fastest way home.
Exactly. So, she wants to get home. It's pouring rain. It's already way later than she wanted to be home. And was like, get me home. I'll, run through wherever I have to get there as fast as possible.
Right. And for all the people that are listening that you can't pull up the map or whatever, maybe you're listening while you're driving. If she got off the bus on Main Street runs, it looks like, at least, east and west. And then you have all of your other streets that we're talking about running north and south. Grand Street essentially runs south from Main Street. Once it hits a certain point, it's a dead end. You hop over the train tracks, but you're back on the other side of Grand Street.
Yes.
So it was only a short distance where it was like not a road. It's not like she was walking through this, densely wooded area or anything. It was literally go down Grand Street, get to the end of the road, it's the train tracks, hop over the train tracks, and Grand Street starts again.
Yes, but what I haven't told you yet is that basically where these train tracks are was like a bunch of abandoned buildings.
Great.
So they had been, old factories and things like that. And you can see even here where that Philip P. Mossad Movers is, there's like this big grassy area. That is the area that we're going to talk about in just a second. Now, Patty Ann never made it home that night, and the next morning on October 23rd, 1984, when Kathleen, her mother, was getting everyone ready for the day, she found that Patty Ann had not slept in her bed. She was incredibly panicked because she knew her daughter was supposed to be coming home the night before. She'd literally talked to her, and she said that she would just be a little bit late. So sometime between 8 a.m. and 8:20 a.m., Patty Ann Gonyea was reported missing to the Worcester Police Department by her mother. Based on early reporting on this case, it appears to me that authorities might not have sent anybody out, and I really don't even know if a missing persons report was actually put in, and I say that based on this statement that I read in an article in the Boston Globe. It stated, quote, "Police noted the call, but did not send an officer out," end quote. So, John, what would you take that as?
I would take that as they were like, okay, she didn't come home. We're not going to send anybody to take a report, but I'll put it out to the officers and let them know that if they find this girl or come in contact with this girl, to maybe get it back in contact with the mom.
Okay,
say, hey,
so
we found your daughter. They're not going out looking for her. They're not going out to take the initial report to get together important information.
Get statements from people who last saw her or something like that, right?
Yeah, it sounds like a poor job of
taking an initial missing persons report.
Yeah, not even. They didn't take one, so it's like, it can't be a piss poor job if they never did it.
This is true, yeah.
It seems like what I'm guessing is between 8 and 8:20. Shift change, maybe.
I was thinking that.
Getting onto day shift. Maybe the people from Midnights didn't pass word along to the day shift people, whatever. Or maybe they were in the middle of roll call. They were like, they got the call. Maybe dispatch gave it down to them while they were having roll call. And then nobody ever went out to address the issue, which is terrible. Especially when you're talking about, a missing juvenile. She's still not 18. She's 17 years old. And you have a panicked mother on the phone saying, oh my God, my daughter would never do this. She was supposed to come home last night. She never came home.
And it's already at this point been like 10 hours since she last spoke to her daughter.
Right. And I mean, it's no secret that women are attacked more frequently than men. You have a young girl that was walking through the city to get home late at night. The last time anybody talked to her was, probably 11 o'clock when she got on the bus and her boyfriend said bye.
Yep.
So, yeah, we're off on the wrong foot with Worcester PD.
So far.
Yes, so far. But
things can turn around.
Things can turn around, but early reporting is very important with any crime.
Yes, completely agree. Now, after the lack of attention received from the PD, needless to say, Patty Ann's family wasn't going to just wait around. So they, as well as friends from the area, began their own search. And after a very short time of searching, someone located Patty Ann's purse on the railroad tracks that she should have crossed when attempting to walk home the night before. And I will say, John and I were just talking about this, so it's stated on the City of Worcester website that the exact address of where all of this was found was at 95 Grand Street, which is that big grassy patch that I was pointing out to you before.
Mm-hmm. Which is right near Philip P. Masad Movers today.
Yes.
Boys and Girls Club way.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And so
that area you were talking about.
Correct. And this location was literally 2 blocks from Patty Ann's home. So they're finding her purse 2 blocks from her house.
Right.
Which already is like...
Yes. I mean, once she gets over those train tracks, she has Canterbury Street, and then boom, she's on Southgate Street.
Literally, probably less than 2 minutes.
Probably a 2-minute walk, yeah.
Yep. Also, something else I wanted to mention, because some sources state that it was both police and the family that found these items, including the purse. And then there are other sources that say family and friends located the purse. Mm-hmm. And then, like, the police came out after to help them. So this goes back to, like, did the police do what they were supposed to do in the initial reporting? Did they come out? Did they find these things? Or is this the family found these things and now the family's like, hello, we're concerned. We called you. No one came out. Now we're finding her purse. Mm-hmm. What's going on here? So there's like 2 different stories, I guess you would call it. So I would say the part about police not being on top of things came out immediately. Mm-hmm. And now today, like more recent reporting makes it kind of seem like the police were there when all of this was going down. So I don't really know what's more accurate, but I've learned that it's best to give you everything I know just to lay it all out there.
Yeah, I think that if both stories are out there and, you know, one is from 40 years ago and one is more current, and who knows, maybe people nowadays are trying to make past mistakes not look so egregious. But there's also the chance that maybe police didn't go to the house to take a report to gather a bunch of information, but maybe some information was given over the phone, disseminated to the officers that were going out on the road, and then they were checking the area for her. And then while they're out there checking, these friends and family are out looking for any evidence as to where she may be. Then they get back in contact with the police, say, hey, we found this. And then the police who were looking for her somewhere else, or maybe, you know, over near the apartment complex, maybe they were talking to people, which is not that far away, if that was there at the time. You know, it's like we often say, most of the times when you have 2 stories, the answer is probably somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
So they could have been out looking for her, just not in the area where the family and friends maybe found the purse.
Yep. Makes sense. Either way, now that this item belonging to Patty Ann had been located, you can imagine how terrified everyone would have been of what they might find if they were to continue searching. So, in one version of events, the family called police again to alert them of what they'd discovered and asked to have an officer dispatched to the area to assist.
Makes sense.
Yes. Just a short time later, at approximately 12:45 p.m. on Tuesday, October 23rd, 1984, an officer with the Worcester PD located Patty Ann Gonyea's nude body in a window well of a factory near the train tracks. Patty Ann's family and friends who had helped in the search that morning were all there when her body was located and watched her be removed from the scene.
It's like Amy Baker.
That's exactly what went through my head when I was thinking of this. Like, they were saying that she had been in a body bag, so I don't know if they had seen her physically, but they were all there watching this girl be removed from this factory. Like, that's heartbreaking.
I always think that there's not really like a scale of grief. Like, grief sucks no matter what.
Oh, for sure.
But when you have, you know, police that find this girl versus police and family finding the girl, or just family finding the girl, like, there are different levels of how bad that sucks, I feel like, because there are images that you'll never be able to get out of your head versus having that information come to you when you're at home versus finding that person yourself,
and physically seeing
and
it.
Physically seeing it, right.
Absolutely. One of the Patties, so I'm going to call like one of, there was the 3 Patties, so it's like one of the Patties said something, but this one I'm pretty sure was Patty maiden name Morgan, married name Dansereau.
Okay.
She told Mass Live, quote, "As a teenage girl, that was not an easy thing to see, them taking our friend away," end quote. And her friends actually later made comments that really stuck out to me about what happened to their friend. And I think it's something that you probably think about. Like if you have experienced something like this, or if you know someone that has, or even people who just consume true crime and listen to these stories. But I feel like it's not something that you hear people say very often. It's probably just one of those thoughts that's kind of in the back of your mind, but you don't like to say it out loud. So one of the Patties stated, quote, "Hopefully she was knocked out and didn't have to suffer," end quote. And then after this comment, the other Patty chimed in and stated, quote, "That's what bothers me the most, knowing that your house was so close, you were yelling out and nobody heard you," end quote.
Yeah.
So like the whole thing about her hoping that her friend wasn't awake for this, that she was unconscious. It's like you think about that, but I feel like a lot of people don't vocalize it to say, oh my God, what my friend went through was horrific. I hope that she wasn't awake for it.
Yeah, it's the same thing where, you hope that it was quick and painless as opposed to being tortured.
Yes, exactly.
It's along that same lines where knowing that this thing did happen to her, that, she didn't feel pain during it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's like one way of coping almost, to like come up with this thing in your head, even though you never really will know what happened. You're like, maybe this will make the grief a little bit easier if I hope that she didn't suffer through this whole thing.
Right.
So the Worcester PD would take the lead on this case. And by the 24th, the day after Patty Ann's body was found, 14 Worcester PD detectives would be assigned to work her case. And this was actually the first murder of a teenage girl in this area in the previous 10 years.
Wow.
So this was a case that was haunting authorities, and it was one they were taking very seriously now that her body had been located. Yes, based on what we talked about a few minutes ago, it does appear as though there may have been a few missteps when she was first reported missing, but I was glad to see that they were now taking things seriously. They're working hard, and they're not going to let, her case just sit there and not be worked.
Right, and I think it's fair to say that any of our speculation on, them maybe dropping the ball in the initial stages of the investigation could be a little misguided, because we don't know if they did leave to go canvass the area and they just didn't, get there at the same time that family and friends found her purse. So I'm sure the information probably got out to officers, but maybe they didn't have the urgency that you would have hoped, especially knowing that a young girl hasn't been murdered there for 10 years.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not like there was a chain of violence or a string of violence going on in the area against young females at the time. It's like, oh, here's another girl, didn't come home at night, maybe she stayed with her boyfriend. They don't have all the information at first.
Yeah.
So.
And I think it goes back to reporting too.
Yeah.
What I'm able to find, what was actually put out.
It's also very important, and a lot of people don't think about this, the information that whoever answers that phone at the police station, whether it be dispatch or another officer or anything, the questions that they ask and the information they gather is, you can't even put a level of importance on it. Because every call that an officer goes to, they're blind except to what their dispatcher has told them.
Yeah.
So it's very important that whoever's answering that phone is asking the right questions and cares about getting the right information too. Because sometimes police may get thrown to the wolves, essentially, but they didn't get any of the information that they should have.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's a multi-level issue. So it's very important that that first line of contact, when somebody's calling the police department, that they do their job just as well, if not better, than the police do theirs.
I agree. Now, for this episode, we're going to follow our normal flow where we discuss each piece to the investigation that I've been able to gather a fair amount of information on. So for this case, we'll be discussing the scene, the items found there, any physical evidence found, whether that be early on or maybe even later on down the line, the autopsy findings, at least the ones that were released publicly, as well as some witness statements authorities received in the days and weeks following Patty Ann's murder. So as always, we'll begin with the scene. Patty Ann had been found near the train tracks where she'd taken that shortcut to get home on the night of October 22nd, but she'd been somewhat hidden and was found in a 6-foot deep window well at the rear of what used to be the Crompton and Knowles factory. However, I did also see it reported that it was previously the Branson Wire Company building, so I really don't know which is more accurate, but we do have the exact address of the location, so take what you will from that.
6-foot deep window well.
Yes.
I don't even know how to interpret that.
So I'm going to send you a couple pictures of like what the factory buildings kind of looked like back then.
Yeah.
And I wonder if maybe that'll give you a better...
I mean, I have a rough estimate in my head, but I can't concretely say that I know what that means.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So looking at that picture that I just sent you, if you look over like towards the ground on the left-hand side there, I think those are the same size as the windows above it, but they almost go like below ground.
Okay.
Do you see what I mean?
Oh, okay. So when you said 6 foot deep, I was thinking like in depth as far as walking into it.
No. So I think it was like down.
6 feet down from ground level, essentially.
That's what I would think, at least looking at what this building looked like, especially because you can only really see essentially half of that window.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's 6 feet deep, probably from wherever the ground level was, but you think that there's probably some type of concrete, barrier, I guess, where then the building itself would dip lower.
Yes.
So you're essentially looking into that window well. It would be into like a basement almost.
Yeah, that's exactly what I would think.
Below ground level.
Yes.
Okay. And this was abandoned at the time.
Correct. The most upsetting thing about where her body had been found is what I mentioned a little while ago, the fact that she was so close to her house. Like she probably could have made it there in under 2 minutes. And when I was researching this case, I really felt the same way that her friends did, knowing that she was so close and someone might have even been able to hear her. And I'm pretty sure her brother had mentioned at some point, too, that like he felt like if he had just gone outside or if someone had just gone outside that they would have been there and they would have been able to save her. And that, like, oh my God, this case has made me cry like a lot.
Yeah,
and,
I can understand
like, just hearing these things that this family has said, I'm like, oh my God, it's just so heartbreaking. Like when you look at cases like this one, like Amy Baker, where it's like family finds them or they're so close to home and they like, if circumstances were just a little bit different, it just sucks.
Yeah, and I think that's like the worst part of grief is you have people like her family members saying, oh, if I had just gone outside, I might have heard her. But that's not necessarily true either.
I know. It's like...
But you always want to have like wishful thinking, like, oh, I could have done this, I could have done that.
Yeah.
But you can't go back and change that, and there's no surety in the fact that anything would have been different if you had gone outside.
Exactly, yeah. And that's like how people end up beating themselves up, and we all do that. It's normal, but it just, it's this shitty thing, like when you're looking at it from the outside looking in and, seeing how much these people were hurting, but then also like having them blame themselves too. Like it's really crappy. And I think also for someone like me or someone like John or all these other people that are listening that are not from the Worcester area, you don't really realize how close it actually is until you really visualize it and you see it on a map. And John, I'm actually going to show you like a little clip from a segment that was done on WCVB with Kathy Curran that shows just how close the house and the railroad tracks and everything was. And for anyone listening, I'll put a link to the YouTube video on our website so that you can, hop over and take a look if you want to, because it gives a better visual than like just looking at an overhead view from Google Maps. Like you can literally see her house.
I guess.
I mean, it just puts it into a better perspective, at least for me, where it's like looking at an overhead map, you can be like, oh my God, it was so close. But then when you look at it from knowing that her standing where she was standing, she could literally see her own home.
Yes.
That's why I wanted to show you that, because I feel like it gives a little bit better perspective.
It adds more gravity to how close she actually was to her house.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you can say, oh, she was 2 blocks away. But when you put yourself on a street and you look 2 blocks away, it's like what? If you think about it, a telephone pole is 100 feet from each other. You're probably looking at 400 or 500 feet maybe.
Yeah, you could sprint that in no time.
Yeah.
Now, it appeared as though Patty Ann's killer had attempted to hide her body. First of all, because she was found in this relatively deep window well, but secondly, because her body had been partially covered by debris, specifically with items like cardboard and lumber that the killer had likely found and used from within that vacant area around the factory and the railroad tracks. Now, in terms of what was found at the scene, evidence located there, physical or otherwise, we know that Patty Ann's purse had been located nearby on the railroad tracks, and it was stated that her purse was only about 100 feet from where her body was found in the window well. Not only was her purse found, though, but so were her clothes and other personal items that belonged to her. And it was stated that some of those items even included proofs of her graduation photos, which were found strewn about close to the window well. And her leather jacket that she'd worn home was also discovered nearby and was said to be, quote, spotted with blood, end quote.
So the only thing that was found on the tracks was the purse, and everything else was kind of found around her at the window well?
That's what I understand it as, but I'm wondering if maybe this person like jumped out and almost ambushed her on the tracks. She dropped her purse, and then maybe she was pulled back towards the factory.
Yeah, I mean, if it's raining and you're carrying an umbrella, you got to think of the pattering of rain on the umbrella. You can't really hear a lot of what's going on around you. You're focused on just getting to your destination.
Yep.
So you're not super aware of everything around you. Kind of head down, move forward, and just get there. So somebody very well could have just snuck up behind her.
Yeah.
Maybe had been following her for an extended period of time. And then when she was in the open and there was really nobody around, they kind of snatched her and then brought her over to the area where the window well was.
Yeah, agreed. Now, as John just mentioned, we were talking about heavy rainfall from the night before, and Patty Ann had her umbrella with her. You know, obviously she was using that to keep dry on her walk home. And you can probably imagine, you know, the fact that it was raining so much, you're probably thinking all the evidence had to have been washed away.
Most likely. I'm sure a lot of good evidence was.
Well, thankfully, that's not actually the case. And I wonder if the individual that killed her, putting her in the window well, like almost is going to be the thing that gets them caught because her body wasn't laid out in the rain.
Yep.
Maybe more evidence was able to be taken from her body because
she was covered.
Yeah, like in this window well and then covered with this other stuff too.
Yeah, I mean, it would be quite a feat for investigators to finally pin this crime on someone, and it ends up being, you know, the fact that they wanted to bring her to a more secluded area of this abandoned building where it was a little bit more dry, and maybe any cries for help would have been drowned out because she was more inside like a building area, is what ends up getting them caught because the rain wasn't able to wash away all the evidence.
And I hope it is. I hope that's the thing that nails this guy.
I do too.
So within the first 3 to 4 days, authorities did publicly announce that they were able to collect evidence at the scene despite all the heavy rainfall. But as per usual with these cases, early on anyway, authorities were keeping the details of exactly what type of evidence they'd located close to the chest. They were sending the evidence to the FBI headquarters to test, which is yet another statement that seems pretty common in these older cases, but there will actually be more information in regards to physical evidence as we continue on with the story, but we will get to that in just a little bit.
I would say that it seems so common that in a lot of cases, it's like, oh, we send stuff to the FBI, whatever. Like, as new technology is becoming available, these higher government agencies are the ones that are going to gain access to it sooner.
Yeah.
So if Worcester PD can send that to somebody else that has better technology to help solve this crime,
definitely
just seems like the right thing to do.
Yeah, I feel like it's just always the response. It's like, we found evidence, we're sending it off, we can't tell you shit.
Yeah.
And it makes sense. Like, I get it. It just makes me think of the Idaho murders right now and the fact that they were so hush-hush and
lying to the public, which I called from the very beginning.
Yes, you did.
But okay.
And, you know, I think that's fair. I think that's totally fair in the initial stages of an investigation.
Unless people are in danger and they need to be notified, like, hey, you need to be on high alert and don't go by yourself out at night, things like that. That's the stuff that should be put out to the public. But as far as like how they're going to solve their investigation or information that they have, these agencies are under no obligation to give that out to the public.
Honestly, like, for several years, I wouldn't even say anything. I think, you know, obviously our listeners hear us gripe about things once we're 40 years in and a family has struggled for that long with no answers. That's when you're like, okay, guys, what are you doing?
Right. Or if they're hitting a wall in the investigation and they need additional information that maybe only members of the public can give them, that's when they start putting out more, because it's a give and take relationship. It's like, hey, this is what we have, but we need this. We'll give you this to get this in return. Yeah,
makes perfect sense. All right, so now we're going to move on to the autopsy results. And there were 2 MEs that were mentioned in reporting on this case, Dr. Jerome Fielding, as well as Dr. Brian Blackburn. I'm not 100% sure which of them actually completed the autopsy or if it was a joint effort, but either way, Patty Ann's body had been transported to the University of Massachusetts Hospital to be completed and for them to assess her cause of death and injuries. It was stated that Patty Ann's cause of death had been blunt force trauma to the head, and the ME did note that there were multiple injuries to her head that caused her death. We had also just talked a few minutes ago about how Patty Ann had been nude when she was found, so knowing that information, you might believe that she'd been sexually assaulted, but authorities did not release that information publicly up front. However, there were comments from one of Patty Ann's brothers in the early days of this investigation where he did mention to the press that his sister had been sexually assaulted. And it did appear to be confirmed by investigators working this case years and years down the line. So even though they didn't come out with it directly at first, they did later confirm, I think it was in 2009, that Patty Ann was sexually assaulted before she was killed.
Yeah, and I would assume that her brother had that information because the family should be privy to the information of the autopsy.
Mm-hmm.
And even if investigators are like, no, you can't put out any of this information, whatever, as a family member, you have your own obligation and want answers. And
Absolutely.
If you want to put that information out, go for it.
Yep, makes sense.
Just know that when you're putting out information that investigators are telling you not to, you may be hindering the investigation, but that's your choice to make if you have the info.
Yeah, it is. Now, the ME was also able to pin down a time of death for Patty Ann, which was said to be roughly around midnight that night. So that would have been approximately 45 minutes to an hour after she'd been last seen getting off the bus. And there is one other thing that I wanted to bring up now as we discuss the autopsy, but this is something that I never saw reported until I think roughly 2009. And it has to do with something that one of the detectives who was later working on this case decades down the line was able to glean from the crime scene photos. Apparently, there had been a very thin wire that was seen wrapped around Patty Ann's neck. Now, this is something that I would assume would have been noted in the autopsy, but I don't understand why it's reported that the detective working on the case in, the 2000s had to go and scrutinize these photos in order to find this piece of information.
Yeah, we're talking like 25 years later.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think it's important to mention this, regardless of how it contributed to her death or not. But I just find it to be so strange that that's how this is portrayed in the media, with the interviews with these detectives saying, oh, I scrutinized these crime scene photos and I was able to find this by looking really closely at her neck. Why was that not something that was just like in the autopsy?
I don't know. I'm a little skeptical on this piece of information because if you're only scrutinizing a photograph, and we're talking a photograph, maybe a Polaroid or rolled film from the 80s, there could be blemishes and things that are not really present in real life that show up in the photo. So, you think investigators are gathering this information and they don't find a thin wire around this girl's neck?
That's what I'm wondering.
Or there's no note of, strangulation in the autopsy?
Or that wasn't
damage
put
to her
in.
throat?
Yeah, or that wasn't put in like the notes that I assume the officers would put in their report.
Right.
You're following through on this whole investigation. You're obviously documenting what you're seeing.
Yeah, and you're also talking about a thin wire. So when you think about a thin wire, like when it's pulled tightly across flesh, you got to assume that it's either cutting into it or leaving some type of abrasion on it.
Or indentation
or damage to your throat.
Yeah.
Something that would be documented. Maybe it's not released. Maybe it was documented in the autopsy and it just wasn't released. But,
yeah,
to say that her cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head from multiple strikes, and then this other investigator 25 years later is just looking over the crime scene photos and he's like, oh, I see this thin wire across her neck. How did the people that weren't there on scene see that?
Yeah, so I actually wanted to read exactly what this Telegram and Gazette article says so that you know exactly like how this is being portrayed.
Yeah.
That it's not just me, like,
I know, it's just
misconstruing
like,
it or whatever.
I need more
to
understand this because it just doesn't make sense to me.
It doesn't make sense to me either, and I don't think what I'm going to read to you is going to help you with that. But
Great.
It states, quote, authorities ruled she died from a skull fracture. Lieutenant Grady also found, through close scrutiny of crime scene photographs, that a wire was wrapped around her neck, end quote.
There was never a wire that was seized from the scene?
That's what I'm saying. Like, wouldn't that be in an
wire
evidence bag or?
Could this wire have been something that was just like trash or garbage from this
All the stuff that the
mill that was closed. You know what I mean? Like, if she was covered in debris, what kind of mill was this? Did this mill have thin
so that's
things
another
of wire?
thing. So
Could he have just thrown all this stuff on top of her and then it landed on her neck and it wasn't actually used in the commission of the crime?
Yeah, but you remember when we were talking earlier about what this old factory building used to be, they said it was either a Crompton and Knowles building or the Branson Wire Company.
Yeah.
So then I'm like, okay, so maybe this was something that was found there, but the whole thing just doesn't make sense at the end of the day because this was never mentioned early on and they're saying that it was found just based on looking at crime scene photos.
Right. I would assume, if I had to put my hat on something, that when this perpetrator was throwing debris on top of her to try and cover his tracks, that maybe this wire was within that debris.
That's what I would think
and landed
too.
On her.
Yeah.
Because generally with the autopsy, if you're going to release cause of death, multiple strikes to the head and a skull fracture, you would also say, and ligature marks around her neck, which may not have been the cause of death, but may have led to what happened.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody ran up behind her with a thin wire and started choking her and then subdued her that way and then killed her when she was trying to run away, it's just, I can't say that I believe that because this person saw a wire in a photograph 25 years later, that had anything to do with her murder.
Yeah, and I would just think, like, why are you putting this out to the public like this unless you...
It's a red herring to me.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I kind of agree, so...
Unless there was information from the autopsy that came out that there was damage to her throat.
Yeah, and maybe they just didn't have the wire or something, and he was trying to, like, see if he could see it in the photo or something like that.
Maybe. I don't know.
Really know.
And just before we move on, there was no mention of a murder weapon that was located, or there was no mention in the autopsy what she could have been struck with?
No, and we're going to dive into something in just a little bit that might give you more of an indication. I've only ever seen it reported in this one place, and I don't really know exactly how much I trust it.
Okay.
So we'll discuss that in a few, and you'll see exactly what I mean.
All right. Only reason I asked that is obviously outside of wanting to know what the murder weapon was, we're talking old mill buildings built with brick.
Yep.
Could she have been thrown up against the brick wall? And could the building itself essentially have been the murder weapon? But if that wasn't put out to anybody, and we're going to get into something later, I'll leave it at that.
That we will. All right, so now we're going to move on to witness statements. Authorities stated that within the first week or so of their investigation, they'd spoken to over 100 potential witnesses to get statements from. But I really only know of 2 witness statements that hold any value that have been reported publicly. One of which coming from the driver of the bus Patty Ann had taken to get home the night of the 22nd. So we'll start with him. From what I could find, it seems as though Patty Ann's mother, Kathleen, had spoken to the bus driver, and the media kind of reported it as such. I mean, I would assume that this individual also provided a statement to police, but I just wanted to make it known that it was kind of portrayed that Kathleen was the person that talked to the bus driver. But either way, this bus driver stated that he actually had a conversation with Patty Ann while she was on the bus headed towards home. And from what I've gathered, everything seemed totally fine. There was like nothing off, totally normal conversation with the bus driver. And he also stated that he saw that Patty Ann was alone when she got off the bus. And it didn't appear that anyone was like waiting at the bus stop for her or anything like that. So it was just a totally normal interaction with him.
Also, I assume that we can believe that nobody was sitting in the back of the bus watching her. And then when she got off, they got off and followed her. I assume that she exited the bus alone. That's
exactly what it seems like based on the bus driver's statement.
Okay.
And there was this one other witness statement that came from a man who lived on or around either Grand or Gates Street, one of which was the same road that Patty Ann had been walking along on her shortcut to get home. Honestly, he could have lived on either street. I really don't know. But he was out walking his dog. So that's how he ended up seeing her.
So it doesn't matter where he lived. He was out walking his dog, and he could have very well been on Grand when she was walking by.
Exactly, yes.
Or one of the other streets that runs perpendicular.
Unless he's like one of those people like us that like puts our dog out in our front yard. He could have just had like a patch of grass in front of his home and done that. So either way, this witness stated that he'd seen a man walking behind Patty Ann, roughly 50 feet behind her, when he saw her while he was out walking his dog. And from what I've gathered, this witness thought nothing of it at first. He didn't recognize or know the man that he'd seen, And he didn't even know that it was Patty Ann walking with the umbrella until he heard about what happened to her, and then he put two and two together. He'd remembered seeing her walking with her umbrella open and seeing this guy behind her. And all I've seen of a description of the man was that he was a roughly 6 foot tall white male. Other than that, I don't know of any more descriptive features about this guy. And based on this, I really don't know if this witness would have even been able to describe what this guy looked like to a sketch artist or anything like that.
Right. I mean, it's raining.
You're far away.
Right. And I mean, it's the middle of the night. Middle of the night.
Exactly.
Plus rain, plus distance.
Mm-hmm. I'm surprised he was even able to say he was a 6 foot tall white guy.
Yeah, true. I mean, probably just a rough estimate.
Yeah.
But
my eyesight sucks at night, so.
I'm so bad at gauging people's heights, too.
Oh my God, me too. I'm horrible.
I'm just like, you're 5'8".
I wonder if he knew
5'9".
Patty Ann, though, and he knew how tall she was and kind of gauged it based on.
Well, I hope not. Then that's another person outside of her family. That's another person saying, well, if I had just called out to her and said, hey, there's a guy following you, or
that's true.
Hey, what are you doing following that girl, calling out the guy for doing it? You know, could have changed things, but that could very well be a thought that runs through his mind, too.
Yeah, that's true.
Outside of the victim, there are always more victims to a crime like this.
Mm-hmm. Now, after this information was put out, authorities stated that they were receiving a lot of calls from people in the area, and they were tracking down any and all leads that came their way. But after this initial reporting, I personally couldn't find much else in the local papers about Patty Ann's case for years. As per usual, this could just be a lack of older newspapers becoming digitized, and I'm unable to find them, but based on searching newspapers.com, as well as other archival websites for local papers from '84, I wasn't able to find anything else. So that kind of forces us to now fast forward all the way to 2006. In 2006, it's kind of when things seem to be heating up in the media with Patty Ann's case. But I gotta say, what came out in 2006 was a Nancy Grace segment.
Oh, everybody loves Nancy Grace, don't they?
Yeah. So this whole thing was honestly obnoxious and borderline insensitive, if you ask me. And unfortunately, I was not able to find the actual video footage of what was aired, but I did locate the transcripts of it, which if you want to read and review that, a link will be in the source material under this episode's blog post on our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com. And John, I will send a link to the transcripts to you now if you want to follow along as well.
Okay, well, I hope that you have a quote in here and you're going to use your best Nancy Grace voice to try and read that quote.
I have multiple quotes, but I don't know what a good Nancy Grace voice is, and I don't want to use that voice, so...
Well, you know she was down on Royal Worcester Apartment Road, and I can't believe that guy that was walking his dog didn't yell out to her and warn her about the guy behind her.
That is probably the best Nancy Grace impression I've ever heard. I love it. So I want to first start out with what I found to be particularly insensitive about this whole thing, obviously other than the commentary pretty much throughout the whole thing, but it's how this whole transcript begins when they start to discuss Patty Ann's case. So I'm going to read it for you. It states, quote, unidentified female. He also had a knife, and I see where he cut her. But that isn't what killed her, they told me. What killed her was when he grabbed her by the hair and smashed her head and kept smashing it against a brick wall. And they said that's what actually killed her, end quote. So within my script I had, first and foremost, but now I'm going to first and foremost before that, because this matches up to exactly what John just said a few minutes ago about the way in which he thought maybe Patty Ann had been killed. Mm-hmm. And secondly, the problem that I have with this whole thing is Patty Ann's mother is being interviewed for this segment. Her family and her friends are going to see it. And I just felt like you're going to start this segment off with this aggressive, graphic description of how this poor girl was potentially killed. It's like,
hey, if
Jesus.
It bleeds, it leads.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I was like, wow, that is insensitive.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know who this unidentified female is that supposedly said that. I mean, maybe for all I know, it could have been someone that was close with Patty Ann, but I feel like that's like a really, descriptive, graphic way of explaining someone's death for TV, and it seems like they're just trying to get ratings and get people pulled in because it's,
Also, if this is an unidentified female, not that every witness needs to be identified or needs to out themselves or whatever, but how do we even know that this is factually true? Or they didn't just hear about all the stuff that happened with it and they followed the news reports throughout the years And then they came up with this story, reached out to the news network and was like, I have information on this. Bring me on Nancy Grace.
Yeah, so that's why I said when you were asking before if we knew anything about a murder weapon, that this is the only thing I've ever seen about the potential of a murder weapon, and how you said essentially could the building itself have been? And I didn't want to say yes because, you know, we were moving on to this next thing. But I guess if that's accurate, yes, that's true. Or if this is just some random statement that someone made up, then we don't know what the murder weapon could have been.
Well, I mean, it came to my mind because it's a possibility. Generally speaking, I mean, maybe for a word that you love to hear now, maybe ne'er-do-wells do travel around with weapons on them. I mean, maybe he had a knife on him. A knife is a very common thing to carry, whether it be work-related or just for self-protection, whatever.
Yeah.
But, like, if she died due to blunt force trauma to the head from multiple strikes, and you have a gigantic brick building right where she was found, makes sense. I mean, maybe this person knows it to be true. Maybe this person's making it up, but it's not a stretch of the imagination to think that that could have happened.
No, absolutely not. But all that aside, during this segment, Nancy speaks to, or I guess you would call it interviews, several individuals. There's Kim Ring, a reporter with Worcester's Telegram and Gazette. Tom Shamshak, who was, yes,
Why
John,
does that sound familiar?
John gave me the look. He was the PI that we talked about in Molly Bish's episode.
Yes.
He worked with the Molly Bish Foundation. Nancy also interviews Kathleen Vivlamore, Patty Ann's mother, as well as a woman named Catherine Burton, who had the title of psychologist. Then there's John Kelly, a criminal profiler with Stalk Incorporated. And lastly, Renee Rockwell, who was titled as a defense attorney. So there were like a lot of people on this segment. And I felt like it was just so all over the place, at least based on the transcript. I can only imagine what it was like actually physically seeing it on video.
I just keep honing in onto this one line from Nancy Grace.
What is it?
Whoa, 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 whoa. Wait. Who spotted a man walking behind her?
Yep. That's what I mean. Like, it's very insensitive.
She's over the top. I can't stand her.
Yes. So.
Sorry, all the Nancy Grace fans, but.
But anyway, let's begin with Tom, the PI. And it appears as though in 2006, he'd volunteered to help with Patty Ann's case after her family had come to the Molly Bish Foundation for assistance, which made even more sense to me once I discovered that just several years after Patty Ann had been killed, Kathleen had moved her family to Warren, Massachusetts, which is where Molly Bish and her family were from. And I did just want to make mention of one thing. I actually listened to a podcast that had covered Patty Ann's case today, and I think it's called Pop It. And I think the two hosts are from the Worcester area, and they had covered Molly Bish's case and got in contact with Heather Bish, her sister, and, you know, they were chatting about Patty's case. And something that just totally warmed my heart and just makes me, you know, I love what we're doing here and, like, meeting all these people who have been affected by tragedy and just, like, doing good with it. And Heather said to these two girls that anytime that Molly's case is talked about, she will always bring up Patty Ann's case because Patty never got the same attention that Molly did. And they were talking about, you know, like socioeconomic status and those kinds of things. And Molly Bish's case was national. It was everywhere. Everyone talked about it. Whereas for Patty Ann, it stayed very local and there still wasn't a ton of coverage. So Heather said, you know, this is this thing that she does now. If anyone's bringing up Molly, she's bringing up Patty Ann because she deserves to be talked about. And I was like, that is just so awesome to do for her. So I just wanted to throw that in there and, you know, bring that up now. So
good on Heather.
Absolutely. But as we move forward, I do kind of want to dissect this Nancy Grace segment and kind of break it down into pieces and like what each piece of the interview kind of shed some light on or helped me to learn, or if I was upset with it, if I agreed, disagreed. And then John's got this face right now that you guys just aren't seeing, but I want to get his thoughts on all of it too.
Obviously, I have my preconceived opinion on Nancy Grace. I don't like her. I think she's rude. I think she's crude. And then to just read the words that I know that she regularly says.
I know.
I'm just like, every time I see it, I'm just like, how does anybody give her a platform? Because I'm just like, one of the lines for you guys. Grace, what physical evidence are we talking about? Oh, wait a minute. Look at this girl. What a little cutie. Had good grades, no problems, went to her boyfriend's home. He lived with his family. They had a little game of Trivial Pursuit. Like, really? Like, there's a way to talk about this.
Yes.
That's not just like this.
Yes. I feel so much for her mother, being on this, and we'll talk about her interview piece in a few minutes.
It's a double-edged sword because you want to get the information out there,
yes.
But if you have to go through Nancy Grace, it's
yes.
like, could it not be anybody else?
Exactly. Like, John and I are literally of the same brain, but let's start with Kim Ring. So during this part of the segment is where we learn about the witness statement from the person who was out walking their dog, as well as comments in regards to if Patty Ann had been sexually assaulted. And at this point, this interview was done in 2006, so that was still not something the police had confirmed definitively to the public. That would come a few years later, but it was still something that people were quite hung up on, and obviously it's probably why Nancy Grace was asking about it. After that was Tom Shamshak, and Nancy wanted him to provide some more information on the case, and he's saying how he didn't want to give up pertinent info. And John and I thought that it would be interesting to kind of act out this little section of the transcript. So I'm going to read for Tom. John will be Nancy. Okay, so Tom says, quote, "Well, again, without really disclosing what's going on, I can tell you that demonstrative steps are being taken to look at physical evidence that would link an individual to that crime and..."
Tom, you know how much I respect you. You're a former police chief, you're a current private investigator, but Tom, it's been 20 years. What do you mean without disclosing a secret? It's been 20 years. Don't you think it's time that we disclose what we've got to try to solve these mysteries? They're not just mysteries like a movie. This is a real little girl. This destroyed her whole family.
Listen, Nancy, I share your observation that the situation has lingered there. But after the family came to the Molly Bish Foundation, we jump-started this investigation, went to local law enforcement, and have been, Beverly Gravison, much to her credit, has really dug on this. This is a case that is moving forward. And again, physical evidence is being processed as we speak.
Why is it just being processed now?
Because the private investigator went out and was able to locate a person of interest and...
Whoa. I did not know we have a POI, person of interest.
Okay. So when I was first researching this case and I stumbled across this transcript, this was probably the one thing that I felt like I did agree with Nancy on. The fact that she's like pushing to try and get more information. And obviously the PI's like, no, we have pertinent information here. They've like restarted the whole investigation at this point. So I get why he didn't want to put out info, but it kind of like brought me back to the comments that we made earlier on in the episode and that we make all the time about keeping some information to themselves, but also just putting out like little bits as a case goes decades and decades and decades without anything being put out.
Yes. And I also agree with Nancy Grace's sentiment, as hard as that is for me to say.
But not the delivery.
Not the delivery. Her problem is she can't hide emotions on her face, and she speaks without a filter, or if she is speaking with a filter, it's the rude filter.
Yeah, but the whole thing is like, when she says, Tom, you know how much I respect you.
Yeah, it's just like
when
you say but after something, how it negates everything you just said.
Yes, it's like a backhanded comment. So, yes, I understand where she's coming from. I did agree with, wanting to get more information about a case because there really, at this point, is not that much that's been released in Patty Ann's case. You're 20 years on now. Of course you want to know more. You want to do what you can. Nancy Grace obviously knew that she had a wide audience. She wants to get as much out to the public as possible. But again, it just comes back to that delivery and just the insensitivity of it all.
Yeah, and I guess if this is her on-screen persona to drum up controversy and to make things, 10 levels higher than they would be in a normal conversation, okay, I guess that's why she's on the air and that's why she has a show. And
pick a different topic then.
But
not
yes,
something where someone's loved one was brutally murdered.
Right. You want to be sensitive to the people that were actually affected by this, not just, do whatever it is you want because it's what you want to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Change your tone according to the subject.
For sure. And it actually made me like this whole piece of the interview, just wanting to get more information out there, made me think of a really good example of police releasing new information in an older case that's actually been in the news recently. And that has to do with Holly Peranian's case.
Yes, the tank top.
Yes. So when I was first researching Patty Ann's murder, the information on Holly's case had not been put out to the public yet. So I put 2 and 2 together as I was literally writing this episode. And then I went back into these transcripts and I realized and remembered that Holly's case is actually one of the 3 cases that's discussed in this Nancy Grace segment from '06, which was just like this wild coincidence. But either way, what I'm trying to get at is what John just brought up in regards to a tank top that was found nearby to where Holly's body was found back in 1993. And it's something they've had since literally day one. They sent it out for additional testing, and now they're showing it to the public, and they're asking for help in identifying this piece of evidence. Those are the things that, we're always hoping that police will put out more of, because you know, they're probably only giving you like 15% of what they know.
In response to the tank top, I think if they found that early on during their initial investigation, that should be put out post-haste.
You think?
I mean, if you can't track down where that tank top was sold, who it may have belonged to, or retrieve any sweat DNA or anything from it, and you're really just trying to track down somebody that may have owned that or a place that may have sold that, and then you can go back and look at all of the sales records to try and track down somebody that may have bought it. That's something like, hey, do you know anybody that owns or has owned a tank top like this? That's something I think should be put out early on.
Yeah, but then you think
because that's something that can fade from memory very easily.
Yes, I totally agree with that. But I just think about like what the detectives back then would have been thinking. And now you've got different people working on the case. So everyone's got a different perspective on what they think should be put out and what shouldn't. So maybe the detectives back then were like, this is big. We need to keep this close to the chest. And now that it's been so long, 30 years now, they're like, okay, what can we do? What can we put out that isn't going to be detrimental to our case, but that may be the missing link to have someone come forward with even anything? They were like, say they have a DNA sample and it matches nothing, but someone can link that to somebody else. Can they then compare that or, something?
Like, oh yeah, that tank top was sold at the Boston Marathon on this day or this year or something like that. Like, that's the information that you may be able to get from it all these years later. But I think that once you have, hit that wall and you can't gain any more information from having that piece of evidence unless you get something from somebody else, then it should be put out to people. I think, just like a sketch. If somebody was like, oh yeah, I can give you a total description of a suspect. They were wearing the backwards hat with lime green bill on it and
a denim shirt that says Christie's on it.
Right. If they give you all that information, police are going to put that out there.
Yeah.
So the fact that you found this piece of clothing that did not belong to her and on that scene, that seems like something that I personally would believe should be put out sooner rather than later. But where is that line drawn?
Yes, that's the hard part. But okay, so let's get back on track with this interview. So during that small conversation with Tom, it was mentioned that physical evidence was being tested and that there was a person of interest in the case at the time. But that was like glossed over. If you look at the transcripts, they almost immediately move over to Kathleen, Patty Ann's mother. And I feel like this, quick pan to Kathleen in this interview probably has something to do with it being live TV and they're like pulling her in at a specific time and you can't, backtrack and ignore the new person that's coming on screen. I get it. But it's like they don't circle back to it either, which is like huge. Wouldn't you want to put that information out to your millions of listeners, Nancy Grace?
Right. Just so our listeners know, and for those of you that can't take the time to pull up the transcripts and look at this as you're listening, we have the line that I read, whoa, 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 I didn't know we have a POI, person of interest.
Yeah.
Shamshack responds, yes. And then Grace says, straight to Patricia's mother, Kathleen Vivlamore. Miss Vivlamore, thank you for being with us. Yeah. Literally nothing else is said about that. Nope. It's not like, oh, can you give us any information on this person of interest? No, literally nothing. Tom says yes.
Like aggressive
on to
move.
The next guest.
Yes.
Like, okay, that seems like something you might want to put out. If you're going to say that you have a POI, maybe give some information on it.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing that I meant with, this is live TV. Kathleen's on now. You can't just, push her segment back even further. Like, they are obviously on a time crunch because they probably only have so much time for their
and
segment.
Somewhat scripted, too.
Yes, but you would think that you're going to backtrack to that once you've finished your next interview because that is huge. That is huge.
Nancy Grace, you would assume that as she's, giving her monologue or whatever later on or wrapping up, today we learned this, and maybe we need to look into this more, or maybe investigators will give out more information on the POI, or circle back or say, we're going to get Tom back on another night to give us more information about this person of interest.
Yeah, I just scrolled down to the bottom to see like what her whole sign-off was, and it was just literally, I want to thank you and all of my guests, especially our victims' families tonight, but our biggest thank you for being with us, inviting us and our legal stories into your homes. A special good night tonight from the New York control room. Good night, everybody. Like,
yeah,
there's probably really big things that you're just totally glossing over, and this is stuff that should be...
What is the actual intent of your show?
That's what I want to know.
We all have our opinions.
Beliefs and our opinions on that. Yep, agreed. But I want to circle back to Kathleen and her interview, and I feel like, at least based on the tone within these transcripts, it does seem to me like Nancy was a bit more sensitive as she spoke with Kathleen compared to her intensity in other portions of this segment. But it was just this very short time that Kathleen was talking about her daughter, and she was telling Nancy and the whole world all about her, and she just breaks down into tears, and they have to like move to the next person. And I was like, oh my, just at every turn with this case, it was like hitting me in my feels, like this poor girl's mother, she's going on Nancy Grace because she wants to be strong and she wants to talk about her daughter and she wants to get her case out there, and then it's like, woof.
It shows you how strong of an effect tragedy like this has on people, because her main goal is to get this information out there and to hopefully help solve her daughter's case. And then once she is bringing up this information and, like reliving that trauma, she just can't help but break down.
Yeah, it's hard. So after that, they then move on to this psychologist, Catherine Burton. And she kind of like pans to this person after she now has discovered that Patty Ann's body had been partially covered. So she's asking this psychologist, what could covering the body mean? And Catherine responds with, quote, well, obviously he was trying to hide. He was trying to hide what he had done, and he took the time. Maybe it means that he had planned it, end quote. Which I definitely do not agree in any way, shape, or form that this person planned it. I think that was just not it, but...
No. The only way, and this is like tinfoil hat, the only way that somebody could have planned this is if whoever was supposed to be giving her a ride...
That's exactly what I knew you were going to say, yep.
...had this planned, and they were like, oh, I'm just never going to go home. She's going to end up getting on the bus. I know where she's going to get off, and then I'm going to attack her from here. That is like the only way that somebody could have planned that, because who else is going to know that she's getting on this bus, getting off, and then trying to go home?
Absolutely. It's... I don't believe it for a second. And that would be like super duper tinfoil hat. Like you're making up theories literally out of thin air.
Right.
So
yes, I don't agree with this psychologist either.
No, but then there is this other comment that she makes after Nancy Grace says something else. So John, I actually want you to read this one for me. It's where Nancy says, well, another issue with us, psychologist Catherine Burton, when a killer knows the victim. So if you want to read that.
Because of my great Nancy Grace voice?
Yes, you've done an excellent job.
Well, another issue with us, psychologist Catherine Burton. When a killer knows the victim, very often, they take the time to hide the body or cover it up. If it's a random killing, they don't care.
And so Catherine Burton responds with, quote, that's right. That's exactly right. They just throw it away like it doesn't mean anything, like a piece of trash. But if they know the body, then they try to preserve it, try to hide it, and cover their tracks, end quote. So first of all, I did not like the fact that she's calling her the body. Like she's a person,
right?
Even though she is now deceased, she was still a person. And
this is a person that is like knows in the books and never had to experience personal trauma. So they just talk about people as if they're things and not actual people.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, actually. But I do kind of agree in one respect that someone trying to hide what they've done, kind of feeling a sense of remorse about it. Maybe this was somebody that knew Patty Ann, but maybe just in passing, and they felt bad for what they'd done. That's why they hid her. That's why they tried to like hide what they had done.
I think they could have felt bad, maybe not for what they did, but like an uncontrollable urge in their mind. And now they were like, oh shit, I just did this and I need to cover it up because the longer that nobody finds her, the longer I have to get away.
This is also true. Yeah, I mean, it could really go either way.
Right, because if you're thinking about, oh, they have remorse for her, would they have left her nude? Would they have just thrown trash and debris over the top of her?
Yeah.
With all of her belongings strewn all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like a relatively brutal murder, too, if her head was bashed against either a brick wall or with some other type of object. Like, this was vicious. This wasn't like...
It was an angry person.
Right, so I don't think that, whoever did this felt bad. I think they were trying to cover their tracks to give themselves more time to get away.
I think that's a fair assumption. Oh, and I think it was John Kelly from Stalk. He may have said within this interview that he felt as though this person was a disorganized offender. And I feel like I definitely agree with that. Like, this isn't someone that's pre-planning or, making sure all their ducks are in a row. This is like a very spur-of-the-moment, anger-fueled killing.
Yeah, I agree with that, especially if the building was used to injure her.
Yeah, I agree.
Because you have no weapon. I know there was mention of the knife, and there was, of course, that mention in a photograph of a thin wire around her neck, but
nothing definitively put out by police working this case to say 100% this is what we know.
Right. So I would say disorganized, I can agree with. Maybe saw this girl walking alone and wanted to take advantage of her. Maybe she put up a fight, and he wasn't expecting that, and whatever ended up happening happened.
Yeah.
But I don't agree with the psychologist saying that this person cared about her or knew her, and that's why they covered her up.
Yeah, I agree. So now I want to circle back yet again to this whole potential person of interest situation that was brought up, and it was completely glossed over when it came to Tom bringing it up. But then it does essentially get talked about again, but I do not know if this is an actual person of interest, because what Tom was saying is like they have a person of interest. Whereas in this next portion, when Nancy is talking with John Kelly from Stalk Incorporated, he brings up someone that he believes should be a person of interest. So I don't know if this is actually anyone who was on authorities' radar, the PI's radar.
I think that would be a conflict of interest if both of these people, Tom and Stalk, the guy from Stalk, are both guests on this interview, and one person seems a little apprehensive to give out information about a person of interest, and then this other person is like, hey, you should look at this person. If they were the same, I would be pretty fucking pissed if I was working this investigation. This guy just came out and blurted this guy's information, and now he's on high alert knowing that we're looking at him.
Well, he wouldn't have been, because he was in jail. So
okay, but you understand what I'm saying, right?
Yes, I totally know what you're saying, 100%. So I would have to assume then that it's not the same person. But the person that John Kelly brought up was a man named Peter Mason. So I wanted to kind of dive into that guy a little bit, kind of what happened with him, what he was convicted of, and then we can kind of, move back into the timeline and work through what comes out in Patty Ann's case after this 2006 Nancy Grace segment.
So this guy from Stalk is essentially saying that investigators should look at this guy who's currently in prison in 2006.
Correct.
But was most likely out and active committing crimes back when Patty Ann was murdered.
Yep. Now, just to preface this next part, I have been trying to find more information on this Peter Mason guy, but I'll tell you, it is not that easy to find arrest records in Massachusetts. So far, I've only been able to find paid reports, and Peter Mason is a pretty dang common name, and I was not going to go pay for like 10 different reports for arrest records of people that probably weren't even this guy. And, it's a lot easier to find arrest records in Rhode Island. But if any of our listeners know how to obtain those records easily, I would literally love you forever if you could tell me. But based on what I've been able to find, I have a fair bit of information. So I'm just going to give you what I know outside of, the records that I wasn't able to pull.
And this is information on Peter Mason.
Correct. So back on May 7th, 2001, two women, Jane Downs, who was 40 at the time, and Carol Tabeau, I think is how you pronounce it, who was 53 at the time, had been found deceased in practically the same location and were determined to have been killed within a day or two of each other. According to reporting done in the Telegram and Gazette on these two women's murders, one of the women was said to have been killed on May 4th, the other 2 days later on May 6th, and both of their bodies were found, I believe, on the same day, May 7th. They were located approximately 25 to 30 feet from each other behind an old factory building in an industrial area in Worcester. Jane's body was located more in the open, whereas Carol's was hidden under a lot of brush approximately 30 feet from Jane.
And I assume that this building or mill was still abandoned at the time or was working at the time, or?
I don't know the exact building.
Okay.
Hold on.
But in the general area.
Of what?
Where Patty Ann was killed.
So yeah, these two buildings are only about 0.8 miles or a 4-minute drive from each other. So they are not very far in proximity from where Patty Ann was killed versus where these two women were killed in 2001.
Okay, so same industrial type area.
Yep.
Not the same building, but close proximity.
Correct.
But we are talking 17 years later.
Yes. Now, it was reported that Jane's cause of death was asphyxia by ligature strangulation, and she'd also been beaten, and it was determined that the murder weapon used to strangle her were her own underwear. After she'd been killed, she was then tied to a tree stump in that, abandoned lot behind the factory. The second woman, Carol, had, I believe, also been beaten, with the Telegram and Gazette reporting that she had, quote, suffered multiple rib fractures and had a bruise on the top of her head, end quote. But her official cause of death was reported in that same article as cardiorespiratory arrest.
So a heart attack, probably?
That's what I would assume that was. I mean, I guess that could be induced from...
the shock and the fear?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But either way, Peter Mason wound up on authorities' radar pretty much right from the start. As mentioned previously, I wasn't able to find detailed arrest records for him, but based on my research, this man had a bad history. He had sexual assault convictions that went back to 1971, which was well before Patty Ann had been sexually assaulted and killed, so honestly, who knows what he could have been doing from 71 to 2001 when these other murders took place.
Call me... I almost said Harambe.
I was going to say Sally, but okay.
No, I was thinking Hammurabi.
Ah, yes. What's that one again?
Eye for an eye. Tooth for a tooth.
Uh-huh.
When you have a serial offender, particularly a sexual offender, and you have the ability to chemically castrate them, I say do it.
You should.
Obviously, people can be sexually assaulted by other means other than, genitalia.
Agreed.
But fuck these people.
Absolutely.
If they're constantly going out sexually assaulting people, that is physical and mental trauma that their victims are going to have to deal with the rest of their life. Why should they be able to do a little bit of time in jail and then go on living their lives
and do it
to
again?
be able to be a repeat offender again?
Yeah, fuck that.
Chop it off or chemically castrate, please.
Sounds like a plan to me. So Peter Mason was brought in to be questioned by police literally the day after these two women's bodies were found. So that was on May 8th, 2001. And he was questioned after witnesses had put him at the bar where one of the victims, Jane, was last seen. Investigators collected hair and blood from him, as well as some of his clothing, and he was linked to the murder of Jane by that, meaning the hair and the blood evidence, along with a bite mark that was found on her right arm. And I did also see it reported that Peter Mason apparently told authorities that he didn't know these women, but it was later discovered that he and Jane had supposedly been engaged for a time prior to her murder. Yeah, absolutely ridiculous.
Talk about a bad lie.
Honestly, come on, buddy. Now, in regards to physical evidence in Carol's murder, authorities stated that was, quote, slim or weak. But based on reporting in this same Telegram and Gazette piece, Peter Mason apparently confessed to another inmate that he had killed both women. Mason would actually later plead guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter and was sentenced to 30 to 32 years in prison. And authorities said he'd likely die behind bars due to the fact that he was in bad health. And there was this article in the Telegram and Gazette that kind of outlined what was going on there. So I just wanted to read this particular paragraph for you so, it might help you kind of understand why he pled guilty to manslaughter instead. So it states, quote, Peter Mason, 55, had been charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the 2001 slayings of 40-year-old Jane Downs of Warren and 53-year-old Carol Tabot of Worcester, but was sentenced to a total of 30 to 32 years in state prison after pleading guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter, end quote. So that would make me think he was charged, and somehow, some way, he was able to plead down to manslaughter instead.
It's strange. I don't know why he would be able to plead down to manslaughter for Jane's. I guess I understand with Carol's, because if she died due to some heart-related issue, he didn't necessarily kill her, but his actions may have killed her.
This is true, yeah.
So, I don't know. I think that plea deals are kind of bullshit sometimes, but...
I totally agree.
It's always a money game to not have to go to trial. to get people in jail when they deserve to be in there, but maybe just not as long. But
it always makes me think back to Tammy Belanger's case and like the guy who was, looked into as potentially having some involvement, especially with the case down in Florida too. And he was in Florida at the time, and then he's back up in New Hampshire, and this whole thing, and how like absolutely infuriating it was that he was not in jail and he had the opportunity to potentially do these things. Like, why? You have done so many horrible things in your life. Why are you out?
Yeah, I think it's hard to sometimes drop the hammer on somebody after one offense. It's not really, because I could drop the hammer on a lot of people. But but when you have a habitual offender, fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, shame on you. Like, the second that you have committed this crime multiple occasions and have been convicted of it, like, you can't be trusted to be out in society.
Nope.
Sorry, the world would be better off without you, because you're just causing pain and mayhem.
Absolutely.
To those around you. So goodbye.
I totally agree. It's just ridiculous.
I don't know. Maybe I just have high expectations for people that live in society. Don't rape people. Don't assault people. Don't steal from people.
Like, come on.
You know what I mean? Like, these lax judges and these lax politicians that want to let all these habitual offenders out. Like, sure, okay. You can let this criminal out, and I'm going to set him up in a tent right on your corner of your street, and
you watch him. You
like
babysit him. Like, right? You deal with it. Don't make the people of whatever town have to deal with this monster. Like, you're kidding me?
Right. So if people have been convicted of crimes on multiple occasions,
the same crime over and over and over again, like, or
crimes in general, like if they have a propensity to commit crimes all the time, and it's not just some like mental health issue or homelessness issue where they're better off in jail because they get 3 square meals and they can sleep in a bed.
Like that guy that lied about killing Margaret Allen Fox so he could get in prison. Yeah.
All right. That's a totally different thing. But when you have somebody that's like clearly tapped and committing crimes over and over again, it's like there's no leniency.
And there's no fixing that.
In my mind.
It is what it is. Just keep them in there. All right. So back to the topic at hand. I wanted to go over similarities and differences with these cases to kind of see, like, why is it that John Kelly is saying police should be looking into Peter Mason?
Yeah.
And, a lot of the things that he was saying in his interview with Nancy Grace had to do with the fact that he was younger back, obviously, in 1984. He had been committing crimes since 1971 that we know of.
So did he have remorse during the early stages of his criminal career?
Or did he escalate? He started out with sexual assaults and then escalated to a sexual assault and a murder. Are there others like Patty Ann's that have not been solved that could have also been, connected to him in some way?
I guess my most basic question is, was he from the area, or was he in the area where Patty Ann was murdered at the time?
I mean, I would assume so. I don't know anything about him from back then because I can't find any of that information. I don't know if he was incarcerated during the time, but you would have to think that this guy's not going to bring him up as potentially having involvement here.
If he wasn't in the area.
If he wasn't, exactly. So that's kind of why I was like, okay. I think even though I can't personally verify when he was in prison, I would have to think that somebody from a reputable company like this, isn't going to put out false information on a case where a young girl has been killed.
Yeah.
So I think in regards to, similarities, just the fact that these two factory buildings were really close to each other, the fact that, he had been convicted of sexual assaults in the past. We now know years later that Patty Ann was sexually assaulted. And then I personally have not been able to find a freaking picture of this guy, and that's something I feel like is just this common occurrence lately. I felt that way in Bill Sproat and Mary Petrie's case, but John Kelly from Stock Incorporated did say that Peter Mason was in fact a 6-foot-tall white male, and he had also bludgeoned one of his victims. So I think that kind of goes back to the beating death of Carol, how they said she had that bruise on her head. So again, those things are all kind of tracking, and they're making sense with a similar crime. And maybe, he's escalating to this point where if he's supposedly confessing to an inmate that he killed both these women, he just killed 2 women 2 days apart.
Yeah, I can see where you're going with that, and I can see how somebody could make a connection there. But we also can't forget that this was 17 years apart from when Patty Ann was murdered. And, if Worcester PD was so hard up on trying to solve the case of Patty Ann's murder because there hadn't been a young woman killed in that area for 10 plus years, do you really think that they're going to allow this other guy to be like prowling the streets and doing this, going undetected for 17 years until he's connected to these other two women?
No, I mean,
I don't know.
You're
I
right
think
on
that
that,
there
too.
are a lot of bad, shady people out in the world,
yeah.
and you can find evil everywhere. And
This is very true.
without more tying Peter Mason to Patty Ann's murder, I don't know. I think that this is just a guy that took advantage of an area where it may have been, kind of desolate, where nobody went around because these were old factory buildings. Maybe they weren't working at the time and took advantage. I mean, I think that there are some similarities because it seems like these women were on their way home and they could have been followed. Patty Ann seemed to have been followed.
Mm-hmm.
But you can look at a lot of different crimes that occur in similar areas and find connections, but just because there are some connections don't mean that
It
they're
is
actually
the connection.
connected.
Yeah,
Right.
I see what you're saying. All right, so moving back to the timeline. In 2006, there was an additional piece written for the Telegram and Gazette. And this was regarding, again, Molly Bish, Holly Peranian, and Patty Ann Gonyea, and more so focusing on their families and kind of what their lives have been like after they lost their children and changes they were pushing for in their areas and things like that. And at this point, Kathleen had made comments about how she wasn't really in contact with detectives anymore that were working on her daughter's case. And despite having been constantly in touch with one of the original detectives who worked the case, she mentioned she actually talked to that officer pretty regularly. And she told the Telegram and Gazette, quote, "I could pick up the phone and talk to him anytime when he was actively working the case," end quote. Which I thought was like a big deal because I feel like so many times with these cases, and it always brings me back to Jerry, Teresa Corley's sister.
Yep.
And, just the fact that like they're always trying to get in touch and talk to people, and these officers just don't want to give them the time of day. They're like, why do you just call me all the time? Like, put yourself in their shoes.
Yeah, I mean, you thought of Jerry. I also think of Simone Reidinger
Yes.
because you have Detective Godino, who is pretty much at the beck and call
Of Betsy.
of Betsy.
Yeah.
No matter what she needs, when she calls or whatever, he's always willing to take that time to talk to her about things.
Absolutely. That makes a
So-
good detective.
Yeah, it makes a good detective. And I mean, it shows that you care about the people that you're trying to help and the cases that you're trying to solve.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it was also around this time in 2006, we had talked about it with the Nancy Grace segment, but this is when her case had been getting more public attention. And Kathleen did say that she attributed a lot of the publicity this case got later on to the Molly Bish Foundation and their assistance. That goes back to Heather Bish and what she had said.
Okay, that's something that I wanted to mention. It was like, it seems like, yeah, she's getting all this attention now, or her case is getting all this attention now, but it's only getting attention because it's attached to Molly and Holly's case.
And it's attached to these other tragedies that never should have happened.
Right, but I mean, if Molly's case never happened, there wouldn't be this foundation. If
Yeah.
Holly's case didn't happen around the same time and area as Molly's,
There wouldn't be
and
this
they're
connection.
kind of a connection there, it's like this would be yet another case that few people talk about, that nobody hears about. And even though we started hearing about it in 2001 and 2006 and stuff, again, because of these connections, it could be now 2023 and we have nothing since 1984.
Yeah, absolutely.
So good on, again, Heather and
Mm-hmm.
the Molly Bish Foundation and all the people that work there for picking up these other cases that don't get a lot of attention and helping to bring them to the forefront of the public space.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I did just want to say, too, because we had talked about this for a quick second when we were talking about the Nancy Grace segment, but it was in regards to the fact that, they were saying, oh, there's a person of interest. Oh, there's physical evidence. And then, nobody ever circled back to that. But in this piece that was written in the Telegram and Gazette, this is the same year that the Nancy Grace segment came out. They were mentioning that there was evidence being sent to a lab, but there was nothing that had come from that yet.
Okay.
So I think we can say what was brought up in the Nancy Grace segment seemed to be accurate if it's also being reported and, mentioned by family, mentioned by detectives. But now we're going to fast forward again, this time to 2009. And there is a rather lengthy article published yet again in the Telegram and Gazette. And this was written by Scott Croto. And this piece is more so dedicated to discussing the physical evidence and testing being done in Patty Ann's case. And there are two big things discussed in this article. The main one being that there is DNA evidence in this case. As we already knew, there had been evidence that was sent out to be tested early on. It was unclear what that was. We know there was more evidence sent out in 2006. Again, we don't know what that was. But it is, more evidence is being tested as technology gets better. And authorities told the Telegram and Gazette that they weren't really getting anywhere with, quote, conventional investigative work. So that's when they turned to science and they sent these samples out to a company called Human Identification Technologies Incorporated. Now, as I just mentioned, there were two big things discussed in this article, one being that there was DNA, but the other is more discouraging news. And that's that there was not a full DNA sample received based on what was sent out to be tested, and the sample that they do have could possibly be contaminated. So let me back up and give you some background info here. In terms of the partial DNA sample, it was stated that they received a, quote, handful of alleles, a subfragment of DNA, end quote. Of the alleles they did have, some matched Patty Ann, and some of the others matched her boyfriend. There were also still some alleles that didn't match either of them, so that could lead you to believe that the remaining alleles could belong to Patty Ann's killer, which is a fair belief. Investigators did say that they were planning on submitting all of what they had to CODIS to try and find any potential matches to these remaining unmatched alleles, but of course, if they were to find anything, those would only be partial matches. Captain McGinn told the Telegram and Gazette regarding this, quote, "We'll compare that list against the list that has been developed through the gumshoe detective work, of the more ordinary type of detective work. It may be we won't find anything, or there are some leads to go on based on what was discovered," end quote. The trouble with all of this, though, goes back to the comment I made a few minutes ago about the potential for contamination. Lieutenant Grady, as well as the author of this article, said it best, so I'm just going to read this passage for you. Quote, "We have to say potentially because it wasn't unusual for people not to wear gloves back then. We know there is contamination with the slides. We also know there might not be the DNA of the suspect here. It might all be contamination." To show the degree of contamination, Lieutenant Grady also had tissue slides of Miss Gonyea's internal organs sent to the California laboratory. Alleles showing contamination were found on the slides. Even if we got someone who matched some of the alleles, it is not going to be a 1 in 10 trillion match like we normally see. It is more like 1 in 100 or 1,000, end quote. So from what I've gathered, many of the investigators or maybe even the ME or others back then just didn't follow the proper protocol for preserving evidence that we see today. And it's a frustrating thing for a lot of these older cases. And I feel like when we talk about these cases and we say like, oh my God, I hope that there's, DNA there. I hope that we see some movement. And it literally brought me right back to Lisa McBride's case that we did probably almost a year ago now, where they were sending out this DNA and we were so, enthusiastic and hoping that there would be some sort of closure there. And it's like, is there the potential that like all of these samples are contaminated samples? Mm-hmm. And it's just so discouraging when you think back to a case like this. There's no other way to solve this unless somebody is like brave enough and comes forward and they tell the police what they know. Mm-hmm. And that might be the last little piece that's needed because of these stupid mistakes that were made that like you can't do anything about. But
yeah, I think they're mistakes of the time, unfortunately, because like you were saying, those past practices are not the same standards that we hold today. Mm-hmm. Where it's like the second that you touch evidence, I mean, you're watching a TV show and a detective picks something up or blows on it, like was it Twin Pines or Three Pines or whatever?
I gotta tell everyone that story. Okay, so we're watching Three Pines, and what's his name? Amangamash. So he is like looking for the bodies of these two people who were killed, and he finds them in the woods, and they've excavated the scene, and he picks something up. What did he pick up? I don't even remember.
I don't remember.
So he picks something up, and it's got like dust on it, and he just blows on the whole thing, and I was like, and there's all your DNA on the freaking item. Like, you've got to be kidding me. Yeah. I was so beyond aggravated. I'm like, why is this in a television show right now?
Yeah.
And why do I keep calling it a television show? I've done that twice tonight.
It's a TV show.
It is a TV. I mean, I guess it's the same thing, but I'm like, why am I calling it that?
You watch it on your TV.
On your television.
Yeah.
But yeah, so, those are the types of things that I think of with contamination. Like, you would not see that today, even though it's in a freaking TV show that it shouldn't be. But, there's less contamination today, but it just sucks to think about these older cases and having this hope of DNA matching the suspect. And then it's like...
You were thinking Lisa McBride. I was thinking, again, Teresa Corley with the DNA found on the jeans. It ended up being a detective's.
Yeah, that's true.
So, yeah, I think there was a lot of contamination, especially, 80s and
70s and
back.
80s. Yeah, definitely.
But, I mean, I don't know anything about DNA testing and stuff. So I'm like, okay, well, if you have a small amount of DNA to test and you test it, doesn't it still give you information? Like if you have a piece of DNA and it has shreds from 5 different people in it, can you still identify if there were 5 people there?
I think that you probably can. I think it's just a matter of like nailing down a person of interest or even potentially a suspect to say, okay, we can take this and we can test it against them. And I don't know how many times you can like keep testing things and comparing them to people. Yeah, but it was stated that they collected a lot of physical evidence. So I don't know if they actually had like a plethora or...
Well, I mean, you have Patty Ann who was walking through the streets in the rain. She did have an umbrella, but okay. Now, we had her brother coming forward saying that she was sexually assaulted, but police never really said that. And then you were just saying that for some of the DNA that they found her DNA and her boyfriend's DNA. Do we know if her and her boyfriend had sex anytime recently? Was the DNA collected from some type of sexual assault kit? Like, would that really be contaminated by anybody besides the medical examiner if it was collected?
Yeah, that I'm not sure about. And I don't know if...
Questions that should be asked, but I don't know. Like, these are the things that come to my head.
Yeah, those are all fair questions, I think. And, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if her boyfriend and her were sexually active. I know that his family was home when they were playing board games, so who knows if anything would have even happened that night if they were. And
they didn't have their own car because they took the bus back to his house.
Exactly, yeah. And
so they never really had alone time. Who knows? Just questions that I'm wondering, where did this DNA come from? Where did they collect it from? Was it, just touch DNA from item of clothing or whatever, or was it from a sexual assault kit?
Did she attack him? Did she scratch him? Was it from underneath her nails? They said that her jacket had been spotted in blood. Could it have potentially been some of his blood?
Right. Could she have scratched him and injured him and some of his blood splattered onto her jacket? Who knows?
Yeah, I think those are all absolutely fair questions. And like I was just saying a minute ago, there was actually another comment from Captain McGinn in regards to, kind of what they were going to do based on, what they found. And he stated, quote, "If we can attribute that biological sample to a suspect we have, an individual we know in the area, or someone who has done such crimes in the past, then we have a solid lead on which to proceed," end quote.
Okay, that makes sense. That's right.
Exactly. I mean, that's exactly what you would do, who you would compare it to, the type of people that you're looking at.
That's the type of physical evidence that you're looking for to connect physical evidence found to a person of interest that you're keeping your eye on.
Yeah, for sure. Now, fast forward again, this time to 2014. At this point, it had now been 30 years since Patty Ann had been killed, and her friends and family put together a vigil in her name. It seemed like a really sweet remembrance of their friend, with a dozen or so people in attendance. Those that put together the vigil had played the song Purple Rain, as that had apparently been the last movie Patty Ann had seen before she was killed. Her friends and family walked along with candles and balloons, and they told stories of Patty Ann and what they remembered about her, and, it was just this really sweet thing, and, reporters came and they interviewed people, and specifically, of course, they interviewed the other Patties from the 3 Patties crew. And the 2 women kind of reminisced on how the neighborhood used to feel so much safer prior to their friend's murder. And Patty LaCoye stated, quote, "It used to be all families here. We all used to leave our doors open." LaCoye said the family started to leave after the murders and that Gonyea's family was one of them, end quote. And after this reporting done in 2014, I haven't seen much additional discussion regarding Patty Ann's case, and I just feel like it's so wrong. It just brings me right back to the whole thing with Heather Bish and how she always tries to bring it up. So, I'm really glad that this was a case that I was able to find. Sometimes it's harder to find these lesser known cases and to find enough information to produce an episode on. So I'm glad that I was able to locate, her case and to put it out there for everyone.
Yep.
So with that, even though there aren't really many outside of what we've already discussed, we can kind of dive into theories. I know we discussed Peter Mason and that whole situation. Doesn't really seem like, there's the possibility that there's a connection there. I would also assume if he was on authorities' radar that they probably would have tested the DNA that they have, because obviously he would be in CODIS if he's in prison for murder.
Yeah, and he's a deviant serial sexual assaulter.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm sure they have that, and they probably have tested and ruled out against him, because it seems like that's exactly what the captain was saying, that they were going to be testing against, or that they would, take that course of action to...
You would think so. And I mean, it's been almost, like 14 years now since the 2009 DNA bombshell was dropped, and they said that they were going to be testing it. So you would think that if they did have something to tie to Peter Mason, and he's been incarcerated all this time, that they would have done so.
Yes, exactly.
I think the only other theory that we've put forward or that I talked about was the tinfoil hat one, that, somebody knew that she was going to be taking the bus and that they were going to go follow her after she got off the bus.
Yeah, and I just don't see that being possible. I think it's someone that knew her or knew the area. That's something that a lot of people have said, that, especially considering this shortcut, this is a way that teens always went to, try and get places easier, quicker.
Yeah, no, I think that it is without a doubt somebody that's from the area.
Mm-hmm.
You got to think, it's pouring rain out. Who's going to be outside?
Mm-hmm.
Not a lot of people are going to be outside, at least walking to do stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, that one guy, because he had to put his dog out, but your dog's got to go, so you have to do it.
Right. So if you think about it, it could have been somebody hanging outside of their apartment.
Mm-hmm.
It could have been somebody smoking a cigarette outside.
Mm-hmm.
They see this young girl walking down a dead end towards train tracks and essentially an abandoned area of mills and factories.
Yeah.
So it's somebody that knew that they could take advantage of this girl in this area where very few, if anybody, would hear or see what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think that if they knew this area and it was a cut through for people, the reason that they covered her body was to try and hide her so that nobody would bring attention to, oh, a murder just took place here, and then, maybe find out that they were the one that did it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, clearly they're not thinking straight in that moment either, though, because you left all of her stuff behind, and literally there are photos of her within it because there were proofs of her graduation pictures in there. Mm-hmm. So someone's going to connect that this girl didn't come home and now her pictures are strewn about on the ground near the railroad tracks. Clearly this person's not thinking. So I still think it stems back to, yes, someone in the area who probably, like you said, was out on their stairs, smoking a cigarette or something, saw her. And that's probably when that witness started to see this person walking behind her. Mm-hmm. He's at a fair enough behind distance, but he's still, lurking. He's close,
mm-hmm.
but
he was close enough for this witness to
recognize that he was following her.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So somebody from the area, I don't necessarily know if it was somebody that knew her,
mm-hmm.
but was familiar enough with the area, crime of opportunity. Maybe it was going to be a sexual assault, and because she fought back, it ended up being a sexual assault turned murder.
Maybe.
But there's not a whole lot to go on as far as a theory goes. There's nobody to really point your finger at, because I don't think, just based on what we've talked about today, that Peter Mason is necessarily the guy. I think that 17 years is too long of a time to go between murders, and if Worcester PD is on high alert because something like this hadn't happened for, over a decade
mm-hmm.
prior, I don't know. I just think that it could be some type of vagrant person that, was living in the area but had no ties to the area and could just up and leave and go
mm-hmm.
somewhere else, and they were like a ghost, nobody really cared that they were here or there or wherever.
Yeah, it makes me think of when we covered Michael Kleiman's case and authorities had put out, that whole list of questions. If you knew someone who didn't really do drugs or alcohol and all of a sudden they started, mm-hmm. or if they started acting strange, or if they missed a lot of work, or if they abruptly left the area or abruptly changed their appearance.
Yeah.
I wonder if it would be a situation like that with this case,
mm-hmm.
where this person was from the area and maybe they didn't have the means to leave. And, they tried to change their appearance or lay low or skip work, or I don't know, just something to try and keep themselves distanced from it.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, maybe people weren't thinking about that back then to say, well, that guy was acting kind of weird,
mm-hmm.
or that guy did something strange. Or maybe they did leave the area and someone was like, what the heck? My buddy just up and left after living
mm-hmm.
here for 25 years. Why? That's so bizarre.
Yeah, I mean, you got to think too, if this is a low-income housing area,
mm-hmm.
and you just have, this landlord that rents out rooms maybe by the day even, or, short periods of time. If somebody disappears and is no longer there, they're just going to throw their shit out onto the street or whatever and get the next person into the apartment that's going to pay them money. So, it totally could have slipped by that this person was renting a room there or living in an apartment there, and then they murdered this girl and then up and left, and they were just like, oh, whatever, this happens all the time because people just up and leave. And,
yeah. And they were just none the wiser.
Right. Or they didn't connect the dots there. And I don't know. This is it's one of those sad cases where you don't have really any leg to stand on as far as, pointing which direction you think this investigation should go.
Yeah. And I just really hope that, and this just goes back, it's all coming full circle, what I said earlier, just I hope authorities would put out more. After seeing the connection now, you've got Molly Bish and you had the whole stuff with Frank Sumner, and no, the DNA didn't match, but, they're putting out more information. They're talking about Molly's case more. Same thing with Holly now. They're putting out the information about the tank top. And it seems like these 3 cases have really been, brought together, and they're all talked about together a lot. So I'm hoping that, Patty Ann's is the next one that something else comes out and detectives start, maybe giving a little bit more information to say, hey, we've got this, this, and this too. If you were in the area, do you recognize this thing? Or did you recognize someone that looked like this? Or, just something like that I would hope authorities might want to put out now, so long after.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that when you have, like a foundation, like the Molly Bish Foundation, that are steadfast in wanting to solve these unsolved cases, and they're pushing for answers, and they're in contact with law enforcement, I think it's fairly easy for law enforcement to put together some type of press release to say, hey, this is what we have and this is what we're looking for. And I mean, if you only want to do it on anniversaries, it's one time a year. Put something together and put it out. And if you put it out this year on an anniversary and you don't get anything, you don't even have to give them more next year. Just put it out again.
Yes.
And put it out again. It's just an outreach to the public to say, hey, this is the information that we're looking at. We're now in, the times of technology and armchair detectives and people that, look into these unsolved cases as a hobby and want to, take on these cases to try and find more information. You may be able to put something out there or make a request that somebody latches onto, and they dig deep into, a little place that you never looked as an investigator, and they may be able to find something that you overlooked or that you missed, or something that could help further the investigation. And I think it's very easy to just put a little something out there as opposed to, just sitting on it. And when people are like, oh, send it to the cold case unit, they're like, oh, it's an active investigation.
Yeah.
I think communication is key in a lot of things.
Absolutely.
And I think that if communication between law enforcement and the public becomes easier and more common, I think that the public will be more receptive to law enforcement and wanting to help them.
I agree. Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Because as much as, people want these cases to be solved and you want to do right by the families that were affected by these tragedies, there's also a sense of satisfaction when you know something or you find a piece of information and you provide that to the powers that can use that information. There's a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment to those people that says, I found that and I gave that to police, and now we're working this further. So
for sure,
you need to play into the human emotion of, wanting to help and wanting to find something and wanting to be that person that helps figure something out.
And there are a lot of people like that, obviously. Like, we're like that. All the people who are subscribed or, members of Uncovered. And, there are a lot of people like that. And I'm glad you brought it up, because there were actually a couple like really, really small YouTube channels that I had found that had talked about Patty Ann. And it was more so like people from the area who were just going out and like looking at the train tracks and, kind of showing people what that area physically looked like. Obviously not in 1984, but it put
it still
you
shows
there.
You distances to, though, and like could trigger a flashback or a memory or something. It's like weird. It's something that not to derail what you were just saying, but something that I saw on the internet not too long ago. It's like, why can your brain remember that you've forgotten something, but you can't remember what you forgot?
It's so true.
There are little things that you can come upon that can make you remember something that is locked away in the far recesses of your brain.
Yep.
And the more people that are talking about it, the more people that are putting information about it, and the more commonly it's talked about and seen, the better chances you have to solving it, or at least getting answers and moving forward.
Yeah, for sure. Patty Ann's mother passed away in 2010 without ever finding out who killed her daughter. The effect Patty Ann's murder had on her family was profound, and I wanted to read for you how Kathleen described the effect it had on them. Quote, "You have no idea how difficult it was to raise 4 other teenagers. One of my daughters cut herself. The boys turned to drugs and alcohol. 4 years after Patty was murdered, I had a nervous breakdown and turned to alcohol. I finally realized that the whole family was falling apart, and I had to pull myself together. My children needed me. If this could happen to the Bishes, it just proves it could happen to anyone. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, what color you are, or how you spell your name. I still spill a lot of tears." End quote. This is a case that not only had a significant impact on her family, but Patty Ann's tragic murder deeply affected the town she lived in, her friends, her classmates, and the detectives who worked the case as well. A Worcester PD spokesperson told Mass Live, quote, "This case, although unsolved, has been on the minds of many investigators who have worked tirelessly over the years to bring closure for the family. To date, any information received, regardless of how minor it may appear, is pursued to the fullest." End quote. Patty Ann's brother had mentioned once that he was worried his sister would be forgotten, and I just hope their family knows that we won't forget about her, that she is on our minds, and we're putting this episode out there in hopes that someone will come forward with what they know. This case deeply affected me while I was researching, and I really struggled emotionally while learning about Patty Ann's story. She deserved so much better, and even though it's been over 38 years, she deserves justice, and I truly hope that anyone out there who knows something will do the right thing and tell the police what they know. As Patty Ann's brother Frank said, quote, "I would love to see justice. My family would love to see justice. It's been way too long. Way too long." If you know anything about who killed Patty Ann Gonyea in October of 1984, please contact the Worcester Police Detective Unit at 508-799-8651. Thank you all so much for tuning in every week. We're so happy to have you here. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review before you go and follow us on our socials.
You can follow us on Instagram at wicked.deeds.podcast and on Twitter at wickeddeeds. Don't forget to visit our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com, to take a look at any photos from this episode and view our source material.
But most importantly, tune in next week for an all-new episode.